She helped a homeless man in the snow. Then a black SUV pulled up. Emily Carter's breath fogged up the inside of her scarf as she stepped out of the side entrance of Fairview Community Hospital. It was just past 7 o'clock in the Key. Morning. But the skies were still dark, and the world around her was swallowed in a blanket of white. Minneapolis was under siege by a heavy snowstorm, and the streets, barely plowed, reflected the angry glow of the orange street lamps. She tugged, her coat tighter, and shoved her gloved hands deeper into her pockets, her body aching after a 12-hour night shift. The snow crunched under her boots as she made her way toward the hospital parking lot, each gust of wind stabbing through the seams of her clothing like ice needles. All she could think about was the warmth of her apartment, her flannel sheets, and the silence of her small living room where no machines beeped and no one cried out in pain. But as she turned onto 5th Street, a strange shape near the corner caught her eye. At first it looked like a pile of garbage partially buried by the snow, but then it moved. Emily froze. The figure was huddled against a lamppost, wrapped in what looked like a threadbare sleeping bag, barely enough to keep a body from freezing in this weather. A pair of trembling hands clutched the edges of the bag, and a beard crusted with snow twitched as the man's breath stuttered. Cars rolled by without slowing, their tires hissing against the slush, drivers too focused on getting out of the cold to notice anything or anyone. Emily's instincts as a nurse kicked in, even as a voice in her head whispered that she should keep walking. It was dangerous, it was freezing, and she was exhausted. But something about the scene, the sheer helplessness of it, held her there. She crossed the street slowly, her boots skidding slightly. "You hear me?" "Hey," she said, bending down. The man's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot, sunken and unfocused. His lips were blue. He tried to speak, but managed only a wheeze, his body shaking violently under the thin layer of cloth. Without thinking twice, Emily unzipped her coat halfway and pulled out a blanket she kept in the trunk of her car for emergencies. She wrapped it around his shoulders and knelt beside him, pulling out her thermos from her bag. "It's tea," she said softly, unscrewing the lid. "It's still warm, try to drink a little." He tried. His hands were so numb he could barely hold the cup, so she helped him tilt it to his lips. The tea steamed in the cold, and his breath grew a little less erratic with each sip. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, his shaking hand reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and fumbled with something. Eventually, he pulled out a small, torn piece of paper and handed it to her. His fingers brushed against hers, icy and stiff. Emily unfolded the note with care. The ink was smudged and the paper was worn. It had clearly been handled too many times. It read, "A. Wilson, 342 Oak Ridge, Montana." She frowned. "Montana?" she murmured. "What are you doing all?" "The way out here?" The man gave no reply. His eyes fluttered closed again and his body leaned heavily against her. Emily pulled out her phone with one hand, shielding it from the snow with her coat, and dialed emergency services. As she waited for someone to answer, she looked around. No one else had stopped. No one seemed to care. But something about that, addressed Gim, that name, had to stuck with her. By the time she heard the sirens in the distance, the snowfall had grown heavier. Emily stayed beside the man, keeping him upright, murmuring softly, telling him he was not alone. She had no idea then that this small act of kindness would unravel a story far bigger and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. The howling wind pushed harder against Emily Carter's back as she crouched beside the stranger, shielding him as best as she could from the biting snow. The distant wail of an approaching ambulance echoed through the frozen streets, but it still felt painfully far away. She pressed the warm thermos closer to the man's cracked lips, watching as he struggled to take in even the smallest sip. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his body shook as if every nerve inside him was fighting to stay alive. More cars passed, some slowing only slightly to avoid skidding on the icy roads, their drivers barely glancing at the scene on the sidewalk. Emily's mind raced. She could feel the weight of exhaustion in her muscles from the long night at the hospital, but that familiar call to action, the one she could never ignore, had taken over. There was no question of leaving him. Not now. Not like this. Her fingers fumbled to tighten the blanket she had wrapped around his frail shoulders. She pulled off one of her gloves and gently touched his cheek. His skin was alarmingly cold, too cold. She knew the early signs of hypothermia: slurred speech, clumsy movements, confusion. But this man was already past those. His breathing was shallow, his face pale beneath the layer of frost clinging to his beard. "Stay with me, all right? Help is coming," Emily whispered, though she doubted he could hear her. Then, as if from nowhere, the man's trembling hand moved again. He reached weakly toward his pocket, but his fingers barely managed the motion. Emily quickly understood what he was trying to do. She reached into the pocket herself, pulling out the same piece of torn paper he had shown her moments before. This time she noticed the smudges more clearly, the faded writing, the frayed edges. It had been folded and unfolded countless times, clutched by desperate hands. Whoever wrote this address, whoever A. Wilson was, this paper had been meant to last through rough circumstances. She slipped the paper into her own pocket, deciding she would keep it safe until the man could explain its importance himself. If he could explain, the thought unsettled her. The ambulance finally arrived, its red lights flashing against the white snow like warning beacons. 2 paramedics jumped out, bundled against the cold, their faces tense as they moved quickly toward the scene. Emily stood up, waving to them. Male, late 50s, severe hypothermia. He's responsive, but barely, breathing shallow. "I gave him warm tea, but he needs immediate care," she reported, her voice steady from years of training. The paramedics nodded, moving swiftly to assess the man's condition. One of them began checking his vitals, while the other unrolled a stretcher and set up oxygen. Emily hovered nearby, watching closely as they wrapped him in additional thermal blankets and strapped him down for transport. "What's his name?" one of the paramedics asked. Emily shook her head. "I do not know. He could not tell me. All I found was this." She hesitated for a moment before pulling out the note and showing it to the paramedic. The paramedic gave the paper a quick glance, then nodded without comment. The name meant nothing to him, but for Emily, that piece of paper had already taken root in her thoughts. Once they secured the man into the back of the ambulance, the paramedics climbed in, and one of them gestured toward Emily. "Thank you for stopping." Most people would not have. Emily gave a weak smile but said nothing. She knew too well how easy it was for people to look the other way. Life moved fast. People were busy, caught up in their own problems, too afraid or too numb to get involved. But she could never be one of those people. She had seen too many faces in the emergency room, too many patients who had been left unseen, unheard, uncared for. The ambulance door slammed shut. Emily stood still for a moment, watching the vehicle disappear into the swirling snow. Her fingers tightened around the thermos still in her hand. She could easily turn around, get into her car and go home. She could tell herself that she had done enough, that calling for help, offering warmth, and staying until the paramedics arrived was all that anyone could expect. But her legs refused to move toward the car. Instead, she found herself walking slowly toward the nearest coffee shop, the only place nearby still open despite the weather. The warmth inside was immediate, the smell of roasted beans filling the air as the heater blasted away the chill. She ordered another tea, needing something to keep her hands occupied while her mind tried to process what had just happened. Sitting by the window, she unfolded the note again, tracing the letters with her gloved fingertip. A. Wilson, 342 Oak Ridge, Montana. Montana felt like a world away from this frozen corner of Minneapolis. What had brought this man here? Why did he have nothing but this fragile piece of paper? Emily's stomach clenched. She thought about the emptiness in the man's eyes, the way he could barely hold the cup, the desperation with which he had clung to that note. This was not just another case of homelessness. There was more beneath the surface. She could feel it. She stared out the window as the snow continued to fall, burying the streets deeper in white. Somewhere out there, the man was now being treated, maybe even sedated to keep his body from shutting down. But until he could speak, if he ever would, Emily was left with nothing but questions. And somehow, deep down, she knew she would not be able to let this go. The paper felt fragile between Emily's fingers, its edges worn soft from handling. the ink slightly blurred where water or maybe tears had once touched it. She held it delicately, turning it over as though some secret might be hidden on the other side, but there was nothing more. Just that incomplete message, a name and an address hundreds of miles away. The snowstorm outside raged on, pressing against the glass of the small coffee shop where she sat, but Emily hardly noticed. Her eyes kept drifting back to the rough handwriting on the note, A. Wilson, 342 Oak Ridge, Montana. It had been only an hour since the ambulance had taken the man away, yet Emily's thoughts kept circling back to him. There was something haunting about the encounter, not just his desperate state, but the way he had insisted on giving her the paper, as though he understood how important it was, as though he feared that it might be lost if it did not pass into someone else's hands. She took a sip of the tea, now lukewarm, and leaned back against the bench seat, staring at the ceiling of the cafe, trying to will herself to let it go. She told herself again that she had done all she could. The logical part of her brain reminded her that this was not her responsibility, that the hospital staff would care for him, that social services would step in. But there was that other part of her, the part that had chosen nursing as more than just a profession, that knew she would not be able to sleep without understanding more. By the time Emily finished her drink, the sun had begun to rise, casting a dull grey light across the snow-blanketed streets. She slipped the note carefully into her wallet, stood, and left the cafe. Instead of heading home, she turned back, toward the hospital. She could not explain why, but a knot in her stomach told her she needed to know whether the man had survived the trip, whether he was stable, whether he was able to speak yet. Maybe he could tell her himself what that address meant. Inside the hospital, the air was filled with the familiar mix of urgency and fatigue. Nurses moved briskly between rooms, their shoes squeaking on the polished floors, while doctors consulted charts and monitors hummed softly. Emily headed straight for the ER, where she spotted one of the paramedics who had helped load the man into the ambulance. "Hey," she called, approaching him carefully. "Hypothermia. Do you know if he made it?" The man from this morning, the one with the paramedic, recognized her immediately and gave a small nod. "Yeah, they got him stabilized, but he was in rough shape. Severe frostbite on his hands and feet. He's unconscious. They're warming him slowly to avoid shock." Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with worry. "Do they know who he is?" The paramedic shrugged. "No ID, no wallet, just the note you gave us. Is he still here?" "Yeah, in observation, ICU." Emily's feet moved almost without her consent, carrying her down the corridor toward the ICU wing. She stopped just short of the nurse's station, glancing through the glass window into the small room where the man lay. Tubes ran from his arms, and wires connected him to monitors that tracked his heart and oxygen levels. His face looked even more fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the dark circles beneath his eyes made his sunken cheeks appear sharper. He seemed so small beneath the heavy blankets. The sight of him stirred something in her chest. She did not know this man, but the loneliness of his situation was overwhelming. Whoever he was, he had been out there in the snow alone, with no one looking for him, no one caring whether he lived or died. A voice at the nurse's station broke her focus. "Are you family?" Emily turned to see one of the attending nurses eyeing her with polite suspicion. "No," Emily replied quickly. "Someone let me know. But I'm the one who found him. I was hoping—" "If he wakes up," the nurse gave a small nod, though her expression remained neutral. "I can note it in the chart." "Thank you," Emily said, backing away. She returned to the waiting area, sitting down with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The minutes stretched into an hour. She checked the time repeatedly, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones, but refusing to leave. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, she pulled out her phone and typed the address from the note into a search engine. 342 Oak Ridge, Montana, a simple residential address in Billings according to the search result. The house was listed on a real estate site as a modest two-story home with faded blue siding and a white porch. There was no recent sale listed. Nothing unusual appeared in the search results, but something still gnawed at her. On impulse, she typed the name from the note, A. Wilson, and added the city name. Several unrelated results appeared at first. Business owners, old court cases, social media profiles. But then one headline caught her attention. Aaron Wilson, executive disappears following corporate scandal. Emily's eyes widened. She clicked on the link, scanning the article quickly. It was from nearly 2 years earlier. Aaron Wilson, her senior executive at a major pharmaceutical company based in Billings, had gone missing shortly after whistleblower allegations surfaced about the company's illegal clinical trials and falsified drug testing data. According to the report, Wilson had been cooperating with federal investigators before his disappearance. His family claimed he had gone off the grid out of fear for his life. No one had heard from him since. She stared at the photo attached to the article. The man in the picture wore a suit and tie, his hair neat, his face fuller, the confidence of power clear in his eyes. But the shape of the jaw, the curve of the eyebrows, there was no denying the resemblance. It was him, or at least it could be. Emily's heart raced. The man who had nearly frozen to death on the streets of Minneapolis, was he really Aaron Wilson, the missing executive? And if so, what had driven him from Montana to here, stripped of everything, hiding with nothing but a piece of paper? The questions multiplied in her mind, heavy and urgent. If it truly was Aaron Wilson, then his presence in Minneapolis was no accident, and whatever had brought him here was far from over. The snowstorm had eased into a steady, quiet fall by late afternoon, and the streets of Minneapolis, though still slick with ice, began to show signs of life again. Emily Carter remained seated at one of the waiting area benches of the hospital, her mind spinning with the information she had found. The image of Aaron Wilson from the article remained burned. Into her thoughts, the sharp features, the careful smile, the way his eyes seemed to know too much. She kept staring at the photograph on her phone, comparing it in her mind to the gaunt, frostbitten face of the man lying unconscious in the ICU. The resemblance was undeniable, but the question remained. Why was he here? And why was he alone? Unable to sit still, Emily rose and paced quietly near the ICU corridor, glancing every so often toward the room where the man lay sedated. The nurses had not reported any change in his condition, but her instincts told her that the moment he woke up, something significant would happen. She could not shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a story much larger than she could yet comprehend. Outside the hospital, the last light of day began to fade, turning the snow-covered streets into a patchwork of shadows and faint amber reflections from the street lamps. Emily stepped out into the cold again, needing the fresh air to clear her head. She crossed the street toward the small parking lot where she had left her car, but as she approached, a sound caught her attention, the low purr of an engine idling just beyond the corner. It was a large black SUV, parked half on the sidewalk, half on the icy shoulder of the road. The vehicle was sleek, polished even in the grime of winter, its windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. Emily's footsteps slowed as she noticed two men sitting inside, both wearing dark suits, their silhouettes just visible behind the glass. They were not talking. They were not looking at their phones. They were watching. Emily kept walking, pretending not to notice, but her pulse quickened. She turned the corner and ducked behind a row of parked cars, peeking back toward the SUV. One of the men inside was now speaking into a radio, his expression tense. The vehicle's headlights remained off, its presence as deliberate as it was, silent. For several minutes, Emily stood frozen, trying to convince herself that it could be a coincidence. But then the passenger door opened and one of the men stepped out. He was tall, clean-cut, with short dark hair and the kind of stiff posture that screamed military or federal training. His eyes scanned the street methodically before he nodded toward the driver and crossed the road, heading directly toward the hospital entrance. Emily's heart thudded harder against her ribs. She pressed herself lower behind the parked cars, watching as the second man exited the SUV and followed the first, both moving with slow precision, their black coats swaying slightly as they walked. They did not stop to ask for directions. They did not glance around at the building. They moved as though they already knew exactly where they were going. Without thinking, Emily moved quickly across the back of the lot, keeping to the shadows, slipping into a side entrance of the hospital used mostly by staff and delivery drivers. Inside, the warmth felt suffocating against her cold skin, but she ignored the sensation, making her way back toward the ICU hallway. She kept her eyes on the corridor, waiting to see if the two men would appear. It did not take long. Less than 5 minutes after they had entered the building, Emily saw the taller of the two men walking calmly down the hallway. He stopped at the nurse's station, flashed what looked like a badge, and spoke in a low, firm tone. The nurse on duty, clearly unsure, stood to attention, glancing nervously toward the ICU room where the man Emily had rescued still lay unconscious. The second man joined the first, and together they continued toward the room, ignoring the nurse's hesitations. Emily, staying back behind a nearby curtain partition, watched as the two men approached the door to the patient's room, opened it without knocking, and stepped inside. Her stomach turned. She edged closer, staying out of sight, but able to hear the muffled sounds of their voices. One of the men was speaking firmly to the attending physician, who seemed to be explaining the patient's condition, his voice wavering slightly. There was no mistaking the authority the two strangers carried with them. They were not here by accident. They knew exactly who they were looking for. Emily strained to hear more, but the door remained mostly closed. She could just catch snippets. The words priority transfer and authorization from family repeated several times. The doctor did not sound convinced, but the men had the kind of confidence that overruled questions. Then the voices grew quiet, and the door clicked shut. A few moments later, the two men exited the room, walking briskly back toward the elevator. Emily ducked behind the curtain again as they passed, her pulse hammering in her ears. She waited until the soft chime of the elevator indicated that they were gone before stepping back into the hallway. The nurse at the station still looked uneasy, flipping through the chart repeatedly, as though hoping the answers would be written there. Emily approached slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who were they?" she asked quietly. The nurse looked up, startled, then shook her head, said they were from a private security firm, hired by the family. They had paperwork, but I do not know. Something felt off. Emily nodded, biting back the questions that burned on her tongue. She thanked the nurse and walked away, but she could feel the weight of what she had just witnessed settle deep into her chest. Whoever those men were, they had not come for a wellness check. They had come with a plan. And the fact that they showed up so quickly after the man had been found, after Emily had called for help, was not something she could ignore. The black SUV was gone by the time she stepped outside again. The street was quiet, the snow still falling softly around her. But the sense of being watched, of being one step behind something dangerous, lingered. Emily stood there for a long moment, the cold biting into her skin, the note in her wallet pressed tightly against her hip. The name, the address, the photograph from the article, the men in black suits, each piece fit together too easily to be coincidence. Something was happening, something serious, and Emily was now tangled in it, whether she had meant to be or not. Night had fully claimed the sky above Minneapolis, casting long shadows over the city streets glazed with fresh snow. Emily Carter sat hunched over her kitchen table, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off the dark window beside her. She had not gone to bed. Sleep was impossible now. Every lead she had found, every thread of information about Aaron Wilson, pointed toward a story far more complex than a man simply down on his luck. The pieces forming in front of her did not align with the quiet, shivering figure she had helped hours before. If the man in the hospital bed was truly Aaron Wilson, then the reason for his presence here was not a matter of bad fortune, but something calculated, something driven by fear. Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed. In the name again, Aaron Wilson, Montana, missing executive. Dozens of results appeared, each headline more unsettling than the last. The earliest reports from nearly 2 years ago described him as a respected senior vice president at Holbrook Pharmaceuticals, a company based in Billings, Montana. Known for its rapid rise in the biotech sector, Holbrook had built its fortune on aggressive marketing and a series of breakthrough medications. But according to the news archives, their success had not come without cost. Emily scrolled through the articles, reading that Wilson had been named as a cooperating witness in a federal investigation. Allegations claimed that Holbrook had falsified clinical trial data for one of its flagship drugs, a medication used to treat autoimmune disorders. Patients in those trials had suffered severe complications, some of which had ended in death, while the company continued to push forward with production and distribution. Aaron Wilson, according to investigators quoted in the reports, had been ready to provide internal documents and testimony confirming the misconduct. Then, almost overnight, he had vanished. The last confirmed sighting of him had been outside a corporate building in downtown Billings. His car was found abandoned in a parking garage, keys still in the ignition. His bank accounts were frozen, his home empty. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of violence, just silence. What followed was a media frenzy. Speculation ranged from foul play orchestrated by corporate interests to theories that Wilson had fled voluntarily to avoid retribution. His family, interviewed repeatedly in those early days, insisted that he had been terrified for his safety, but determined to tell the truth. His wife, Margaret Wilson, gave a tearful statement to reporters, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She claimed her husband had received multiple threats in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, anonymous messages warning him to stay quiet or face the consequences. The official investigation had dragged on for months without progress. Holbrook Pharmaceuticals publicly denied any involvement, calling Wilson's disappearance tragic and expressing hope for his safe return. Federal authorities had little to offer beyond the confirmation that Wilson had indeed been cooperating with their inquiries. With no leads, no witnesses, and no body, the story eventually faded from the headlines, buried beneath newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But Emily now knew that the story had not ended there. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked through the archived articles. Photographs of Wilson at corporate events showed him smiling, surrounded by executives, polished and confident. But the man she had found in the snow was a ghost of that image. His hair, once neatly styled, had grown wild and unkempt. His frame, once sturdy, was emaciated. His eyes, once sharp, had been hollow and distant. Still, there was no mistaking the features beneath the wear and hardship. Emily's thoughts turned back to the two men in black suits, the way they had walked into the hospital with quiet authority, the confidence of men who had done this before. They had asked no questions because they already knew the answers. Their arrival had not been about discovering the man's identity. It had been about containing him. Feeling the weight of these thoughts, Emily leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. But the unease inside her only deepened. The SUV, the suits, the rushed transfer request under the pretense of family involvement, it all smelled wrong. She could not ignore the possibility that if those men were connected to Holbrook or anyone trying to keep Wilson silent, then he was not safe in that hospital. The fact that he had survived this long was a miracle. But miracles, Emily knew, did not last without help. Driven by a mixture of dread and determination, Emily opened a new browser tab and searched for the latest updates on Holbrook Pharmaceuticals. The company had weathered the public relations storm following Wilson's disappearance and seemed to have recovered well. There were no active lawsuits mentioned, no pending criminal charges, and their stock prices had climbed steadily over the past year. The scandal, it appeared, had been successfully buried. There was no more mention of whistleblower testimony, no more mentions of Aaron Wilson. Emily's gaze drifted back to the note tucked beside her keyboard, the fragile scrap of paper with the Montana address. 342 Oak Ridge. The quiet persistence of that address gnawed at her thoughts. If the man in the hospital was Wilson, why had he clung to this piece of information so desperately? Why carry it all the way from Montana to Minneapolis, holding on to it through whatever nightmare he had endured? Her fingers moved quickly now, typing the address into public records databases, trying to trace any connection. The search returned limited results. The property was still listed under the name of Harold R. Wilson, a man in his 70s, presumed to be Aaron Wilson's father. No recent activity on the deed, no changes of ownership in the past decade. The house, according to public photos, was isolated, sitting on several acres of land outside. Billings? No close neighbors, no clear signs of anyone coming or going in recent months. Emily's thoughts raced. If Aaron had kept this address close, was it a place of safety, or simply the last home he remembered? Was his father still alive? Had he gone there and been turned away, or was this his destination all along? The deeper Emily dug, the clearer it became that answers would not come easily. But each new fact, each uncovered detail, only hardened her resolve. She could feel the lines of the story tightening around her, drawing her in. It was no longer just about a man freezing on the street. It was about corruption, silence, and the price of truth. And Emily Carter was beginning to realize that she had stepped into the middle of a fight far bigger than she had imagined. The early morning light broke slowly over Minneapolis, casting a pale silvery hue across the snow-covered rooftops. Emily Carter had fallen asleep at her kitchen table, her head resting awkwardly against the hard wood, laptop still open and glowing faintly. The note with the Montana address lay beneath her hand, crumpled slightly from where her fingers had clutched it in her sleep. The dreamless rest had done little to ease the tension that had built in her body over the last 24 hours. When she stirred, the stiffness in her neck reminded her of how long she had been awake. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, the events of the previous day rushing back into her mind with painful clarity. The man on the sidewalk, the black SUV, the two men in suits, the realization that the frail figure in the ICU might be Aaron Wilson. And now, the unease that had taken root inside her had grown into something larger, something undeniable. Emily stood and stretched, moving to the window to look out at the street below. Minneapolis remained frozen under the heavy coat of snow, and the quiet of the early hour only made the tension in her chest feel heavier. She turned away from the window and glanced at her phone. Several missed calls from an unknown number blinked on the screen, along with a single voicemail. Her thumb hovered over the notification before she tapped to listen. "Miss Carter, this is Detective James Rowan with the Minneapolis Police Department. I understand you were involved in assisting a man who was brought into Fairview Community Hospital yesterday morning. I would like to speak with you regarding that incident. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." The message ended with a callback number, but something in the tone of the detective's voice made Emily uneasy. There was no urgency, no alarm, just a carefully measured neutrality that suggested this was not simply a routine follow-up. Emily noted the number, but did not call back immediately. Instead, she dressed quickly, grabbed her coat, and headed out the door. She needed answers, and she was not willing to wait for someone else to provide them. She arrived at the hospital. Within half an hour, the cold biting at her cheeks as she stepped through the sliding doors into the familiar warmth of the lobby. The morning shift was already in motion, nurses moving briskly between stations, the quiet buzz of monitors and patient calls filling the space. Emily walked toward the ICU with purpose, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of the two men from the day before. But before she reached the nurses' station, she noticed two figures standing near the reception desk. They were not wearing suits this time. Instead, both men wore dark, heavy coats, and one held a folder tucked beneath his arm. They were speaking quietly to one of the administrative staff, their eyes scanning the surrounding area as if expecting someone to approach. Emily froze, stepping back slightly behind a partition wall, watching them carefully. Even out of their formal attire, their demeanor remained unmistakable, alert, controlled, deliberate. She could feel the weight of their presence in the room, the way they occupied the space like they owned it. One of the men showed a photograph to the receptionist, and Emily caught the briefest glimpse of the image. It was Aaron Wilson's corporate headshot, the same photo she had seen online. The receptionist shook her head, gesturing vaguely toward the ICU, but Emily did not wait to see more. She turned and walked quickly back down the hall, her pulse racing. These men were not law enforcement. She was sure of it now. Whoever they were not here to help. Determined to stay ahead of whatever was unfolding, Emily made her way to the small coffee kiosk near the main entrance, positioning herself where she could watch the lobby without being seen easily. She ordered a drink, pretending to scroll through her phone, all the while keeping her eyes on the two men. They did not remain at the reception desk for long. After exchanging a few more words with the staff member, they moved toward the elevators, their movements calm but with the clear intent of heading toward the ICU floor once again. Emily waited until they disappeared into the elevator before She moved to the reception desk herself. "Excuse me," she said to the receptionist, keeping her tone casual. "Just here. Did they say what agency they're from?" Those two men who were the receptionist, looking flustered, gave a hesitant smile. They said they were private investigators, hired by the family of a patient. They were asking about someone named Aaron Wilson. Emily nodded slowly, trying not to let her face reveal the surge of dread that swept through her. "Did they show credentials?" "Yeah, they flashed some ID, but I did not get a good look at it." "Thanks," Emily replied, stepping away before the receptionist could ask any questions of her own. She knew she could not confront the men directly, at least not yet, but the feeling in her gut, the warning that something dangerous was closing in on Aaron Wilson, had now solidified into certainty. These men were looking for him, and if they were private investigators, they were working for someone with a vested interest in keeping Wilson quiet. Emily left the hospital and returned to her apartment, but she could not stay still. She needed to understand who these men were working for. She needed to know more about the people who might be pulling the strings behind the scenes. If Holbrook Pharmaceuticals truly had the reach and power suggested by the headlines, it was not out of the question that they had hired security contractors or investigators to track down their former executive. Opening her laptop again, Emily began searching for recent news related to Holbrook Pharmaceuticals and any private security firms known to be connected with corporate investigations. The deeper she dug, the more names surfaced. Firms specializing in corporate intelligence, risk assessment, and private enforcement. Among them, one name appeared repeatedly in connection with high-stakes cases of corporate espionage and whistleblower suppression: Vanguard Risk Solutions, a private firm based out of Chicago, known for operating in legal gray zones. Emily leaned closer to the screen, her pulse quickening as she scanned the details. Vanguard had been accused several times in the past of using aggressive tactics to intimidate or track individuals deemed threats to their corporate clients. None of the cases had ever led to formal charges. Their reputation was polished on the surface, but the stories circulating in legal blogs and industry forums painted a darker picture. Emily's eyes narrowed. If Vanguard had been contracted by Holbrook, it would explain the men at the hospital, their quick arrival, their confident demeanor, their insistence on accessing Aaron without interference. As she continued researching, a soft knock sounded at her apartment door. The sudden noise made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She stood cautiously, moving toward the door without making a sound. Another knock, this time a little firmer. Emily hesitated, then peered through the peephole. Two men stood outside, both dressed casually, but with the same composed posture she had seen at the hospital. One of them held a photograph. It was Aaron Wilson. Emily Carter's breath caught in her throat as she stared through the peephole, her fingers clenched tightly around the doorknob. The two men outside stood patiently, their expressions unreadable, the photograph of Aaron Wilson held casually in the hand of the taller man, as if it were nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. But Emily knew better. There was no casual intent here. The photograph was a message, and the quiet confidence of the men on her doorstep told her they were well aware of what they were doing. She stepped back slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, forcing herself to stay calm. Every instinct screamed at her not to answer, not to reveal she was home. She moved quietly to the living room window, pulling the curtain back just enough to catch a glimpse of the street. Their vehicle, a black sedan this time, not the SUV, was parked directly in front of her building. The engine remained idling. The knocking stopped, replaced by the muffled sound of one of the men speaking, his voice just loud enough to carry through the door. "Miss Carter, we know you're home. We only have a few questions. It won't take long." Emily froze. Her breath came shallow and quick, her mind racing through options. Confronting them was not an option. These were not the kind of men who played fair, and every second she spent standing there was another second wasted. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and considered calling the police. But what would she even say? That two men were at her door asking about a patient she had helped, that they had shown up with a photograph. It was not enough. and she knew it. Instead, she crept down the hallway, slipping into her bedroom, where she kept her backpack packed with work essentials. She moved quietly, stuffing the note with the Montana address and her laptop into the bag. She grabbed her coat, pulling the hood over her head as she listened for any sound from the front door. There was another knock, louder this time, followed by the soft click of footsteps retreating down the hall. Emily counted to 10, then moved back to the living room window. One of the men was now standing outside the building, speaking into a phone while the other waited by the car. Without allowing herself time to think further, Emily slipped out the back stairwell, moving quickly down to the alley behind the apartment complex. She kept her head low, glancing back only once before turning the corner and heading for the bus stop 3 blocks away. The cold air burned against her face, but she welcomed the sting. It helped keep her focused. At the bus stop, she checked the schedule and boarded the first bus heading downtown. The vehicle was nearly empty, the only other passengers lost in their own worlds, bundled in winter coats and scarves. Emily slid into a seat near the back, her eyes fixed on the reflection of the streetlights outside as they blurred past. She replayed the scene at her door again and again. There was no doubt now that the men were not acting out of concern for Aaron Wilson's welfare. They were tracking him, and by extension, they were tracking her. She was no longer just a bystander who had helped a stranger. She had become part of the story, a piece on the board, and they were watching her every move. The bus rumbled through the city streets, and Emily's mind raced through what she knew. The Montana address, the company scandal, the sudden appearance of men claiming to be investigators. All of it pointed toward a deliberate attempt to silence Aaron Wilson once and for all. She thought about the way he had clutched the note, barely able to speak, yet still desperate to hand it over. That note was not simply a remnant of his past. It was a message, a last line of hope. Emily's decision solidified in that moment. She could not walk away from this. She could not let those men find Aaron and make him disappear again. If he had risked everything to hold on to that address, if he had endured whatever nightmare had brought him to the streets of Minneapolis, then the least she could do was honor that effort. She needed to find him. She needed to find the truth. By the time the bus reached downtown, the sky had begun to brighten, the early signs of dawn creeping over the horizon. Emily stepped off the bus and headed toward the hospital on foot, choosing side streets and alleys to avoid main roads where she might be more easily spotted. When she reached the staff entrance, she slipped inside, using her badge to access the side corridors that bypassed the main lobby. The ICU hallway was quiet, the overnight nurse seated at the station with a chart in hand. Emily approached carefully, keeping her voice low. "Any change in the John Doe patient from yesterday?" The nurse looked up, surprised to see her. "They moved him early this morning." Emily's stomach dropped. "Moved him where?" "Family request. Transfer." Paperwork was processed overnight. They took him to a private care facility outside the city. Emily's mind raced. "Which facility?" The nurse frowned, flipping through the chart. "It says Green Valley Clinic, that's all I know." Emily nodded quickly, trying to mask the rising panic. She thanked the nurse and turned away, moving down the hallway with quick, deliberate steps. Green Valley Clinic. She pulled out her phone and searched the name, finding the address on the outskirts of Minneapolis. A small private center known for its discretion and high-profile clientele. The perfect place for someone to vanish quietly without questions. She did not waste another moment. Emily hailed a cab outside the hospital and gave the driver the address. The ride was silent, the cab winding through the early morning streets, while Emily kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of the black sedan or the men from her doorstep. When the cab pulled up outside the clinic, Emily paid quickly and stepped out into the cold, her eyes scanning the building's entrance. The facility was quiet, the parking lot nearly empty except for 2 vehicles parked near the back. She recognized one of them immediately, the black sedan from outside her apartment. Emily's heart pounded as she ducked behind a row of hedges lining the parking lot. She watched as one of the men from earlier stepped out of the building, speaking into a phone, pacing slowly near the entrance. The same calm posture, the same deliberate movements. Whatever was happening inside that clinic, it was not meant for public eyes. Emily crouched lower, her breath visible in the morning air, and made her choice. She was going to find Aaron Wilson before they did, and she was not going to wait for permission. The biting wind whipped against Emily Carter's face as she crouched behind the hedges lining the rear parking lot of Green Valley Clinic. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted pavement, and the black sedan remained parked exactly where she had seen it from the cab. The man outside the clinic paced with the same methodical calm, speaking into his phone, pausing every few steps to glance toward the entrance. His behavior confirmed Emily's worst fears. The transfer of Aaron Wilson had not been for his safety. It was a move designed to isolate him, to keep him out of reach from anyone who might ask the wrong questions. Emily pressed herself lower against the hedge line as another man stepped out of the clinic, joining the first. They exchanged a few quiet words, their voices too soft for Emily to catch, but the tension in their body language spoke volumes. These were not caretakers. They were handlers, men accustomed to dealing with threats, not patients. Determined not to waste time, Emily circled the perimeter of the clinic, keeping out of sight. The facility itself was modest, a two-story building with tinted windows and a secured side entrance accessible only by a key card. She scanned the area, noting the surveillance cameras mounted at each corner of the structure. But the back of the building, where the deliveries were likely made, appeared less monitored. A single service door stood near the loading dock, partially shielded by a stack of shipping pallets. Emily crept closer, testing the handle gently. Locked, as expected. She moved quietly around the pallets, searching for any alternative entry, when she noticed a small maintenance window, just large enough for her to slip through if she could get it open. The frost had sealed it tightly, but after a few moments of prying with a metal clip from her backpack, the latch gave way with a soft click. Emily glanced around once more to make sure no one was watching before pulling herself through the narrow, opening and dropping softly onto the tiled floor inside. The air inside the clinic was warm and sterile, heavy with the scent of antiseptic. Emily crouched behind a stack of supply crates, listening carefully. The hallway beyond the storage room was quiet, the soft hum of overhead lights the only sound. She eased the door open and stepped into the corridor. Her senses heightened, every footstep measured. Moving through the hallways, Emily passed several closed doors labeled with patient numbers instead of names, a precaution that only deepened her suspicion about the facility's practices. She kept her head down as she slipped past the nurses' station, where a single attendant sat engrossed in paperwork, unaware of Emily's presence. She reached a junction where the hallway split, one direction leading toward administrative offices, the other deeper into the patient care areas. Emily chose the latter, pressing herself against the wall as voices drifted from an open doorway ahead. She edged closer, listening. Stabilized, but we are keeping him under sedation as requested. No visitors authorized. The paperwork is solid. The voice belonged to one of the nurses, speaking to a man whose reply was too low to catch clearly. Emily's heart raced as she heard the name mentioned again, Wilson. She waited until the voices moved farther down the hall before slipping past the door and continuing her search. Room 624. That was the number she overheard. Emily's eyes scanned the placards along the hallway until she found it. The door closed, the blinds drawn. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sign of activity inside. Silence. Slowly, carefully, Emily turned the handle. The door gave way without resistance, opening into a softly lit room. Aaron Wilson lay on the bed, his frame almost skeletal beneath the white blankets. Tubes ran from his arms, connected to an IV pump, and a heart monitor that beeped steadily in the corner. His face, though pale and gaunt, was unmistakable now, the photograph from the headlines a shadow of the man lying before her. Emily stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. She approached the bed, her chest tightening as she took in the sight of him. The sedation had dulled the lines of tension in his face, but the evidence of his ordeal remained etched into his features. She leaned down, speaking softly. "Aaron, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, a faint reaction that made Emily's heart jump. She reached for the controls of the IV pump, scanning the labels. The sedation dosage was high, likely enough to keep him unresponsive indefinitely. Emily hesitated, then lowered the dose carefully, just enough to bring him closer to consciousness, without shocking his system. Minutes passed before his eyes finally opened, glassy and slow, but focused enough to register her presence. His lips parted, a weak breath escaping. "You should not be here." His voice was a rasp, barely audible, but the fear in his tone was clear. Emily leaned closer. "Me? I know who you are. I know what they're trying to do. I need you to trust." Aaron's eyes widened slightly, the effort of keeping them open visibly draining him. His hand twitched against the blanket, and Emily reached out, gently grasping his fingers. "I found the note," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "There's something important there. The address in Montana. I know Aaron's." Throat worked as he swallowed with difficulty. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again, his voice just a whisper. "The documents, they're hidden there." Emily nodded quickly, urging him to conserve his strength. "You out of here. I will help you, but we need to." Get his grip tightened weakly around her fingers, the desperation in his touch unmistakable. "Dangerous. They know." Emily felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. She could hear footsteps approaching from down the hall, the soft creak of the floor beneath measured steps. Time was running out. She squeezed his hand gently. "Stay awake if you can. I will come back." Without another word, Emily slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her and ducking into a nearby supply closet as the two men from earlier approached, their voices low but intense. "She was here," one of them muttered. "Find out who it was." "The nurse said someone was asking about the patient." Emily held her breath, pressed against the wall of the cramped closet, listening as their footsteps passed. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, but her mind remained clear. The game had changed. She was no longer searching for answers. Now, she was part of the escape plan. Emily Carter waited in silence, pressed against the cold metal wall of the supply closet, listening as the footsteps of the two men echoed down the hallway. Each step they took away from room 624 gave her a sliver of hope. But the tension in her body refused to ease. She could still hear the faint hum of the heart monitor from Aaron Wilson's room, each steady beep like a countdown in her mind. She knew she had only a small window of time before they circled back, suspicious and searching. When the corridor finally fell quiet, Emily eased the closet door open a fraction of an inch, scanning the hallway for movement. Satisfied that it was momentarily clear, she slipped out and moved quickly back toward Aaron's room. She needed more answers. She needed to know what Aaron had risked everything to protect. She could feel the urgency in the way he had gripped her hand, the desperation in his eyes as he struggled to speak through the haze of sedation. Inside the room, Aaron's eyes were half open again, his breathing shallow but more controlled. Emily approached the bed carefully, kneeling beside him so she could speak without raising her voice. "Aaron, listen to me. I need to understand. What is at the Montana address? What did you hide there?" He blinked slowly, his lips parting, the effort to form words visible on his face. "Documents, evidence, company trials, false reports." His voice cracked, and Emily could see the strain it caused him to push through the sedative fog. "Data, patients, harmed. They covered everything." Emily leaned closer, her heart racing as the pieces began to fit together. She remembered the articles she had read, the whistleblower allegations that had vanished from the headlines once Aaron disappeared. But now, hearing it from him directly, the weight of the truth settled on her chest with crushing force. "Holbrook, pharmaceuticals," she said softly, watching for his reaction. Aaron's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, a faint nod confirming what she already suspected. "You were the one trying to expose them." "Illegal trials," Aaron rasped, his voice growing weaker. "Forged results. Children. Untested drugs. Bribes." The horror of his words hit Emily like a physical blow. She had seen the faces of patients at the hospital, children fighting illnesses, parents clinging to hope offered by miracle treatments. The thought that some of those treatments might have been approved under false data, that lives were risked and lost to greed, sickened her. Why Montana? Why that address? She pressed, needing every detail she could gather before the opportunity slipped away. Aaron's hand moved weakly beneath the blanket, his fingers twitching as if trying to grasp something that was not there. Old cabin. Sent copies. Journalist. Gone now. Only originals left. Hidden. Emily's mind raced, connecting the dots. The cabin at 342 Oak Ridge was not just his family home. It was a hiding place, a last resort where Aaron had secured the proof needed to expose Holbrook. But if the journalist who had once been his ally was gone, possibly silenced, then the documents there might be the last remaining evidence. Before Emily could ask another question, the sound of footsteps returned, louder and closer. She jumped up, moving swiftly to the corner of the room, slipping behind the privacy curtain just as the door opened. The two men entered, their voices low but sharp. "Vitals stable. Keep the sedative levels high," one instructed, checking the IV pump. The other man moved to the window, pulling back the blinds slightly to peer out into the parking lot. Emily held her breath, her body pressed flat against the wall, the curtain shielding her from view. She could hear Aaron's breathing, shallow but steady, the monitors continuing their soft rhythm. The men lingered longer than she expected, discussing logistical details about transport arrangements and follow-up care, all with a clinical detachment that made Emily's skin crawl. Finally, after several tense minutes, the door closed again, and their footsteps faded down the hall. Emily waited until the monitors confirmed the silence outside before stepping out from behind the curtain. She approached Aaron again, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I will get those documents," she promised in a whisper. "I will make sure your story is heard." Aaron's eyes opened slightly, gratitude flickering through the exhaustion clouding his gaze. He gave the faintest nod before his eyes slid shut once more, overwhelmed by the drugs running through his system. Emily knew she could not waste another second. She slipped out of the room, retracing her path through the corridors back toward the service entrance. Her mind raced as she considered the next steps. She needed to get to Montana. She needed to find that cabin before the men watching Aaron realized what he had shared. As she exited the clinic and moved quickly through the back lot, Emily's thoughts turned to the logistics of what lay ahead. She would need to travel discreetly, avoid drawing attention, stay ahead of the men who were clearly willing to go to any lengths to prevent the truth from emerging. Back in the safety of her apartment, Emily packed the essentials. She avoided using her phone for searches or communication, suspecting that it could be monitored. Instead, she used a prepaid burner phone she had once purchased for emergencies. She booked a one-way bus ticket to Montana under a false name, paid in cash, and mapped out the route that would take her to Billings and then to the isolated area where the Oak Ridge property was located. As she prepared to leave, Emily paused for a moment, staring at the photograph of Aaron Wilson still displayed on her laptop screen. The man who had been so publicly successful, now reduced to a shadow of himself, fighting to survive not just the cold, but the relentless pursuit of those who wanted him silenced. She closed the laptop and tucked it into her bag. Her resolve was firm now. She was not just helping a stranger anymore. She was fighting for the truth, for the patients who had been harmed, for the justice Aaron had risked everything to achieve. The journey to Montana would be dangerous, but Emily Carter was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The bitter cold of Minneapolis lingered as Emily Carter stepped off the long-distance bus in Billings, Montana. The journey had been grueling, stretched over several hours and multiple transfers to avoid drawing attention. Her hood remained up, concealing most of her face, and she kept her head down as she moved through the small terminal, careful to avoid the handful of security cameras mounted in the corners. The morning light had just begun to warm the horizon, casting a pale glow over the snow-blanketed city. She tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack, the note with the Oak Ridge address, folded securely inside a hidden pocket. With every mile she had traveled, the weight of what she was about to do had grown heavier, but so had her resolve. She could still hear Aaron Wilson's faint voice echoing in her mind, the warning behind his words, the desperation that had pushed him to share what could very well be the last hope of exposing the truth. The bus terminal smelled of old coffee and fuel, the air heavy and still. Emily avoided the taxi stand outside the building and instead walked 3 blocks before flagging down a rideshare using another prepaid account she had set up before. Leaving Minneapolis, she gave the driver directions to a location just short of the actual Oak Ridge address, not ready to risk bringing anyone directly to the cabin until she had a better understanding of what she was walking into. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and thick gloves gripping the wheel, made polite conversation as they moved through the outskirts of the city, but Emily responded only with short nods and vague answers. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, watching as the suburban streets gave way to rural roads and eventually to the winding paths lined by trees heavy with snow. The Montana landscape felt vast and isolating, a stark contrast to the dense city streets she had left behind. When they neared the drop-off point, Emily asked the driver to stop, claiming she was meeting a friend for a hike. She stepped out, into the cold, and waited until the car disappeared down the road before pulling the map from her pocket. The address was still nearly 2 miles away on foot, tucked deeper into the woods where the road narrowed into an unpaved trail. She moved quickly, her boots crunching through the icy ground, breath clouding the air around her face. The wind through the trees made the woods feel alive, whispering and creaking as if they too held secrets. Emily's footsteps were steady, driven by the urgency of the task ahead. She knew that at any moment, the men following Aaron might realize where. The documents were hidden. She had no doubt they would come looking. By the time Emily reached the cabin, the sun had begun to rise higher, casting long shadows across the clearing. The building stood quietly among the trees, weathered but sturdy, its blue siding faded and the white porch dusted with snow. A chimney protruded from the roof, though there was no sign of smoke or recent activity. The place felt abandoned still but not forgotten. Emily approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign that someone might have been there before. Her? No tire tracks, no footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Her fingers hesitated at the handle, half expecting an alarm or trap, but the door gave way easily beneath her touch, creaking softly as it opened inward. Inside, the air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. The furniture remained in place. A small table and 2 worn chairs, a stone fireplace, a battered bookshelf sagging beneath the weight of old novels and scattered papers. Emily moved quietly through the space, every step measured, her ears tuned to the slightest sound. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchenette tucked into the corner and a narrow hallway leading to a back bedroom. She searched, methodically opening drawers, checking beneath the floorboards where they lifted easily from years of use. In the back room, the bed was stripped bare, but a heavy trunk sat against the far wall beneath the window. Emily knelt, running her hand along the edges of the trunk, testing the lock. It was old but secure, the metal rusted at the corners. She reached into her backpack, pulling out a small multi-tool, and began working at the latch, her fingers steady, despite the cold. After several minutes of careful effort, the lock gave way with a dull snap. Inside the trunk, beneath a layer of folded blankets, lay several file folders bound together with string. Emily's breath caught as she lifted them out, her hands shaking slightly as she untied the binding and opened the top folder. The documents inside were dense with technical language, lab results, internal memos, trial data sheets, all stamped, with the logo of Holbrook Pharmaceuticals. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning quickly. Patient IDs, drug dosages, adverse effects, mortality rates. One page in particular caught her attention, a memo detailing the alteration of trial results to meet FDA approval criteria, complete with the names of executives who had signed off on the deception. The signatures were clear, legible, damning. Emily dug deeper into the trunk, finding a small flash drive taped beneath the bottom of the box. She peeled it free, her mind racing with the possibilities of what digital files might be stored inside. If the paper records were this incriminating, the drive could contain even more: emails, scanned documents, perhaps even video evidence. As she gathered the files and secured them back into her backpack, a faint crunch outside the cabin froze her in place. Emily held her breath, listening. Another step, slow and deliberate, moving across the snow outside the front porch. She crept toward the window, peeking through the edge of the curtain just enough to see the silhouette of a man standing at the edge of the clearing, his head turning slowly as he scanned the trees. Another figure emerged behind him, speaking, softly, though Emily could not make out the words. Both wore heavy coats, their posture alert, predatory. The men from Minneapolis. They had found the cabin. Emily's mind raced as she backed away from the window, heart pounding. She needed to get out. She needed to protect what she had found. But the narrowness of the cabin offered few escape routes, and the sounds of footsteps moving closer warned her that time was running out. She secured the backpack tightly to her shoulders, moving toward the rear of the cabin where a small, cracked window offered the only exit. She pushed it open as quietly as she could, sliding through just as the front door creaked open. Outside, the cold hit her hard, but Emily moved fast, ducking behind the side of the cabin, then sprinting toward the cover of the trees. She did not look back. She did not slow down. The hunt had truly begun, and now she was the target. Emily. Carter pressed her back against the rough bark of a pine tree, her breath visible in the frigid Montana air. The forest around her was silent, save for the distant crunch of snow under boots. Her pursuers were close. Clutching the backpack containing the incriminating documents, she knew she had to keep moving. The weight of the evidence inside was matched only by the gravity of what she had learned. As she navigated the dense woods, memories of the documents she had hastily skimmed in the cabin flooded her mind. The files detailed unethical drug trials conducted by Holbrook Pharmaceuticals with falsified results and suppressed adverse effects. The most harrowing revelation was the involvement of her own hospital in Minneapolis. The institution she had dedicated her career to was complicit in administering these unapproved medications to unsuspecting patients. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of a figure ahead. She froze, heart pounding, until the person stepped into the light, Aaron's old colleague Mark, whom she had contacted for help. Mark signaled for silence and led her to a concealed vehicle nearby. Once inside, Emily recounted her findings, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and betrayal. Mark listened intently, his expression grim. He confirmed that the hospital's procurement records showed purchases from Holbrook and that several patients had suffered unexplained complications. Emily felt a surge of anger and determination. She couldn't let this continue. They devised a plan to expose the truth. Mark would gather internal communications and procurement records from the hospital, while Emily would prepare the documents for submission to regulatory authorities and the press. They agreed to meet in a few days at a secure location to compile their findings. As Emily rested that night, the weight of her discovery bore down on her. The institution she trusted had endangered lives, and she had unknowingly been a part of it. But she also knew that with the evidence they had, they could bring justice to the victims and prevent further harm. The next morning, Emily and Mark parted ways, each embarking on their respective missions. Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was resolute. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The snow crunched beneath Emily Carter's boots as she made her way along the narrow trail that led to the meeting point arranged with Mark. The Montana landscape stretched wide and still, the vastness of the white-covered fields interrupted only by clusters of bare trees and the distant silhouette of a lone cabin perched at the edge of a frozen lake. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the snow, but the air remained biting cold, each breath she exhaled forming mist in the frigid air. Emily kept the backpack close to her chest, the weight of the documents inside feeling heavier with every step. The past days had been a blur of movement and anxiety, each moment laced with the fear that the men hunting her would appear from behind the next tree. But Mark had assured her this place was safe, a location known only to a handful of people who still trusted the cause Aaron Wilson had once championed. As she reached the clearing, she saw Mark waiting outside the cabin, his shoulders hunched against the cold, a thick scarf pulled up over his chin. He gave a quick nod as she approached, eyes scanning the horizon behind her to ensure she was alone. "They have been searching around the old cabin," Mark said quietly, as they stepped inside the small, sparsely furnished shelter. "But I do not think they know about this place. Emily set the backpack down on the table, pulling out the folders and the flash drive. I went through as much of it as I could. The paper trail is clear. The trials were illegal. The data was altered. Patients were harmed, and some of the drugs were pushed directly into hospitals, including mine. They used our patients like test subjects. Mark's jaw clenched as he flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning the detailed memos and reports. He paused on one page, pointing to a list of distribution partners. This is how they did it. They laundered the supplies through third-party vendors to hide the origin. On paper, it looks like standard procurement, but the product numbers match the ones flagged in Aaron's initial reports. Emily nodded, feeling the sickness rise in her throat again at the thought. These medications on the shelves at the hospital, I have administered them. I have seen some of. She looked away, clenching her fists to steady the shaking in her hands. Mark reached out, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. You could not have known. That is what they counted on. Trust. They used the system against itself. The flash drive proved even more damning than the papers. Mark's laptop screen lit up with a series of internal emails between Holbrook executives, including high-ranking members of the regulatory affairs team. In one chain, the language was blunt, with direct orders to suppress certain trial results and to fabricate data points needed for FDA approvals. Another folder contained scanned copies of meeting transcripts, where the risks of the drug trials were acknowledged openly, followed by instructions to keep the discussions off the official record. But the most compelling piece was a video file dated nearly 2 years earlier. In the grainy footage, Aaron Wilson sat across from a man identified in the file as Daniel Keene, Holbrook's chief operating officer. The video captured Aaron confronting Keene with concerns about patient safety, citing specific trial outcomes and warning about the dangers of proceeding without proper approvals. Keene's response was chilling in its indifference. "We are too deep into this now," Keene had said, his voice steady. "The shareholders expect results. If we pull back, we lose billions. These people, these patients, they are numbers on a page, nothing more." Emily watched the video twice, her hands trembling as the weight of the words sank in. This was the proof they needed, not just the paper trail, but the explicit confirmation that the highest levels of the company were aware of the risks and chose profit over human lives. "We have to go public with this," Emily said, her voice steady now, anger giving strength to her resolve. "Not just to the authorities, we need the media, the public. If we let this sit in the hands of regulators alone, it could disappear." Mark agreed, and together they made a plan. They would contact Thomas Reed, a veteran, investigative journalist, known for his coverage of corporate corruption and whistleblower cases. Mark had worked with Reed once before and trusted him to handle the story with care. They drafted an encrypted email, attaching portions of the documents and offering to meet in person to hand over the full cash. The reply came faster than they expected. Reed was interested and agreed to a meeting 2 days later at a discreet location outside Billings. He understood the risks and promised complete confidentiality until the story could be verified and ready for publication. As Emily and Mark prepared the materials for transfer, Emily felt the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a sense of clarity, of purpose. For the first time, they were no longer simply running, they were fighting back. But as the evening closed in and the shadows of the trees stretched longer across the snow, Emily could not shake the sense that their time was running short. The men who hunted Aaron would not give up easily, and now that they had taken the next step toward exposing the truth, the danger was sure to escalate. When night fell, Mark secured the documents in a locked case and hid it beneath the floorboards of the cabin. Emily stood at the window, staring out into the dark woods beyond the clearing, her thoughts on the patients who had suffered, the lives lost in the name of corporate greed. "We are doing the right thing," Mark said quietly, from behind her. Emily nodded, her eyes still on the dark horizon. "Then we had better be ready for what comes next." The crisp Montana air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke as Emily Carter and Mark waited outside the small diner where they were scheduled to meet Thomas Reed. The snow beneath their boots had frozen solid overnight, crunching loudly with each step as they paced the parking lot. Despite the layers of winter clothing shielding her from the cold, Emily felt the tension coil tightly inside her chest, the weight of the documents they had brought pressing down on every breath. The folder in Mark's gloved hands contained the last pieces of the evidence they had gathered, proof of the corruption, the false trials, the deliberate harm done by Holbrook Pharmaceuticals. When a dusty green sedan pulled into the lot, parking near the entrance, Emily recognized Thomas Reed immediately. His face was as familiar as his bylines: sharp eyes, graying hair, the steady calm of a man who had spent decades peeling back the layers of lies spun by corporations and politicians alike. He stepped out of the vehicle slowly, adjusting his scarf as he scanned the area before approaching. Mark greeted him with a firm handshake, introducing Emily as the nurse who had discovered Aaron Wilson and brought the evidence forward. Reed listened quietly as they explained, his expression unreadable, though Emily caught the flicker of concern in his eyes as the full scope of the story unfolded. Inside the diner, seated in the farthest booth away from the windows, they laid out the documents. Reed read quickly but thoroughly, his fingers tracing the lines of text, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Emily watched as the weight of the revelations settled into the reporter's features. When he reached the video file of Aaron's confrontation with Daniel Keene, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This," he said softly, "is going to blow the roof off their entire operation." They discussed the safest way to move forward. Reed would not publish immediately. First, he needed to verify the documents independently, cross-reference the data, and secure additional sources if possible. But he assured them that once the story was ready, it would not be buried. He planned to partner with a national outlet that could guarantee exposure too large for Holbrook to smother. The agreement was sealed with quiet determination. Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. The first real step toward justice was in motion, but now they were exposed. The moment Holbrook caught wind of the leak, their response would be swift and merciless. Reed offered them temporary shelter in a safe house used for sensitive sources, located a few miles outside town. Emily hesitated but accepted. With the documents now in Reed's possession, staying hidden was their only viable option until the story went public. The following days were filled with restless waiting. Reed worked tirelessly, verifying the evidence and preparing the first drafts of the article. Emily and Mark remained at the safe house, eyes always on the driveway, hearts jumping at every sound outside. News of Holbrook's aggressive tactics in other cases made them wary, knowing full well that private contractors could be dispatched to locate them. On the fourth night, Reed called with an update. He had secured confirmation from 2 additional former employees of Holbrook, both willing to provide statements under condition of anonymity. With their corroboration and the weight of the physical evidence, the story was ready. The publication date was set for the following Monday, with a coordinated press release and a segment scheduled on a national news network. When the story broke, it hit harder than Emily could have imagined. The headlines swept across every major outlet. Holbrook Pharmaceuticals exposed, whistleblower documents reveal illegal trials, falsified data, and patient harm. The media firestorm was immediate and relentless. Networks ran the footage of Aaron Wilson confronting Keene, and the emails from Holbrook's leadership were displayed across screens nationwide. The public outrage was swift. Patients who had participated in the clinical trials stepped forward with their stories. Families of those who had suffered or died began demanding accountability. The FDA launched an immediate investigation, and within 48 hours, the Department of Justice announced formal charges against several executives, including Daniel Keene. Emily watched the news coverage from the safe house, her hands shaking as she held the remote. Every word of the reports echoed the horror she had felt when first uncovering the documents. But now the silence was broken. The victims had a voice. Within a week, Holbrook's stock price plummeted, investors pulling out as the scandal deepened. Arrests followed, high-ranking officials escorted out of corporate headquarters in handcuffs, their faces pale beneath the flashes of cameras. The company's CEO issued a carefully worded statement of remorse, but the damage was done. Public trust was shattered. Aaron Wilson, still under federal protection, made a brief statement through his attorney, confirming his role as the whistleblower and expressing gratitude to those who had helped bring the truth to light. His whereabouts remained undisclosed for his safety, but Emily received a private message through Mark, a handwritten note from Aaron himself. It read simply, "You saved my life. You saved others. Do not stop." Emily folded the note and placed it inside her journal, keeping it close. The aftermath of the exposure reached into every corner of Emily's life. The hospital where she worked announced a formal review of all pharmaceutical partnerships and procurement processes. Several administrators resigned under pressure as internal investigations revealed complicity in accepting unapproved drugs. Emily was offered a new position, head of the hospital's ethics committee, charged with ensuring that no such violations could happen again. Though the title carried weight, Emily accepted it not for prestige but as a means to safeguard what she believed in. She knew trust would take years to rebuild, but she also knew that change, real change, could only come from standing guard at the gate. Mark, too, found a new path. He left his role as an administrator and began working with patient advocacy groups, using his experience to help others recognize and resist corporate exploitation. As winter melted into spring, Emily stood once more at the edge of the Montana, clearing where the story had begun, the cabin standing quiet beneath the warming sun. She breathed deeply, the air still carrying the sharp bite of the cold, but softened by the promise of renewal. Justice had been served, but Emily knew the fight was far from over. There would always be those willing to sacrifice lives for profit, to twist trust into power. But now, they would know there were people willing to stand against them. She turned. Away from the cabin, her steps steady as she walked back toward the path ahead, ready for whatever would come next. As the story reached its end, Emily Carter remained vigilant. A nurse, a fighter, and now, a guardian of truth. The 13 parts of the story have been successfully completed. If you need adjustments, I am at your disposal.